Hey, this is Sasha, and welcome to Backstage Income. And in this show, we focus on bringing you behind the scenes so that you can see how to grow a profitable business. So welcome to episode number 2. And in this episode, we're going to take a look at 6 tips on what makes a great podcast cover for your show. So within these 6 tips, we're going to cover keeping things simple in your design. We're going to look at using a minimal quantity of words, select easy to read fonts, properly use images and icons, being consistent with your image, and thinking about the future of your show. So these are the points that we're going to cover throughout this episode. So let's get started with point number 1, which is keeping your designs simple. So as we take a look at keeping your designs simple, I want you to really take a look at some of these designs that I have on screen. And if you're just listening to us, then just bear with me and I'll explain some of these designs for you. So looking at some of these designs, I just took a screenshot of a list of different podcasts here, podcast cover artwork. And you can see that some of these are a little more complicated where they have multiple elements in them, and others a little more simple where they just have a few words and one kind of icon. So let me start out with kind of the most simple one out here, which I would say is probably a good job brain cover art. And we just have basically an orange background with the words good job brain and a little mustache icon right underneath. I'd say this one is the simplest approach, and it catches your attention and you know and understand what's happening very quickly. And that's really why you want to keep your design very simple. The more complicated your design, the more your audience has to really digest and figure out what's going on behind the scene. Now, sometimes that's not a bad thing, depending on what you're trying to do, but in retrospect, it starts to be a little more clutter to the eyes. Think of this as having 10 different colors to a room. Whereas instead, if you have one color in a room, one wall is one color and all the other walls match, then it creates a form of simplicity. But if every wall is different, you're going to get that complexity in the design. Not to say that that's always a bad thing depending on what you're trying to do, but a majority of the time, it drains the energy of the audience. So as we look through some of these other designs here, we have WTF with Mark Marone, and you can see that that one is just basically has a blue background with those words and then his face. We also have another simple one with Bill Burr's Monday Morning Podcast. Just has an image, I would imagine, of Bill Burr, black background there, and again, lower left is kind of the writing, so just a handful of words there. We have another one that's very simple, just says food stuff, and you have a plate there with kind of a bluish starburst effect. So all of these, as you take a look, are very simple in their own way. Some of them are a little more complicated, like here is E&C's Pod of Awesomeness, where they have a little more going on in the background there. There's 2 heads instead of 1 head. Many podcasts have just one person in the face listed if they have a person, but in this case there's 2 people. Sometimes I've seen some that have 3 or 4 or 5 heads in there, but that makes it a little more complicated. So keeping things a little more simple will allow your audience to really just digest exactly what it is and understand what's going on, and it doesn't drain the energy. Makes it a lot more likely that they'll click through on your show or podcast through the artwork. Let's go to point number 2, quantity of words. So here I have a few more examples as we take a look at the overall images, and you can see that some of them have a few words and others have many more words. So starting out with the more complicated one, going into more complexity, again, think of point number 1 as we talk about the quantity of words. Point number 1 is keeping things simple. So as we go into the quantity of words, the more words that you use, again, the more that your audience has to read. And remember, the goal of the artwork is really that they click through to your podcast so they get more. It's kind of like the goal of the cover of a book is so that they buy the book to read the book. And here the goal is that they click through to go in and listen or watch you. So here, as we look at Couple Co, working with your spouse for fun and profit, you can see that one is more wordy. Not saying that it's bad to have a little more words, but you want it very clean and clear to the point of what it's about and easy to read. So that one has a little more words, and you can see what it is and what it's about, but the audience does have to read a little bit more to understand what the podcast is all about. And by doing so, it really just drains you a little more energetically. If we look at another one here, Online Marketing Made Easy by Amy Porterfield, which is a very popular marketing podcast. This one has, let's say, about 4 words plus the name. So when you look at the 4 words, it's a much more simple, easy to understand. What is the podcast about? Online Marketing Made Easy. So it's a simple name to the podcast, and you understand exactly what it's about. Another one here is Building a Story Brand with Donald Miller. This one has a little bit more words. So you can see when you go from Amy Porterfield's to right here, Donald Miller's cover, he has a little bit more words within his cover art. But if you're able to read it, it still may be okay. As long as you're not cluttering things with paragraphs, you should be just fine within your artwork. So just understand that the more words that you have, the more your audience has to try and read that. And sometimes they may skip it unintentionally, just the sheer fact of ease of use, or kind of the ease factor. They might just skip that podcast or looking at it because it just seems like there's too much to read for the eyes. So they move to another one where they really just can understand exactly what it is by looking at the picture. So anyways, keeping your quantity of words to a limit is helpful to give the audience a quick decision making process. Let's look at point number 3, selecting easy to read fonts. When you look at creating your podcast, you want to make sure you're having fonts that are very clean and crisp. Okay, so if you're using cursive fonts, sometimes they're a little bit more difficult to read. So here we have the Gold Digger Podcast, which is marketing, social media, creative entrepreneurship. There's a lady with a dress on there, and the words are gold digger or gold digger. And when you have goal right there written out, you can see that sometimes you may make the mistake. Is it goal or is it gold? Because the podcast overall, the phrase gold digger is much more common than goal digger. And therefore, as you start reading and looking at the cursive, the way that things are created, you can actually spot that could it be goal or is it gold? And this is why it's important that you choose easy to read fonts, because humans will make mistakes naturally. It's just part of our human behavior that we're trying to make things as easy as possible. And even me, just looking at the podcast there, made that simple mistake because of the natural way of saying goal digger rather than gold digger. So take a look at some of these other fonts. Most of the fonts that people use are very nice and bold. They're very crisp, easy to read. A lot of times without much cursive, many effects or things like that. Not a lot of grungy fonts. Very simple, to the point, easy and clean to read fonts are best. If you do plan to use some kind of cursive font, typically make it one word at most. And oftentimes, instead of going with a cursive, many people will choose to go with italic because it's not as, it doesn't obstruct the view of the artwork as much. So make things with your font easy, nice and big, bold, so that it's easy to read. Let's take a look at our next point, which is images and icons. As we look at a lot of these comedy podcasts here that I've created, you can see that there's a lot of them have many different kinds of images. So some images are easy to read and easy to spot, and others a little more complicated. So when you take a look at images, a catchy image will definitely stand out much more because it's catchy. So for example, the first one that we have is kind of 2 shirtless guys, the dollop with Dave Anthony and Gareth Reynolds. You know, they're shirtless there in kind of a cartoony way. Again, looking at the fonts, easy to read, very thick. It's simple. It's 2 guys right there kind of having fun with guns. And you can see it's catchy. The next one we have is Tiger Belly, also simple, one word, two word kind of podcast. But when you look at the image, you have a little bit of a bigger gentleman there who's a little Asian. And then you also have a woman who kind of is wearing a two-piece outfit, who's holding a sword. So again, it's catchy, but again, you're looking at, okay, well, how catchy is it? How provocative do I want to be? And is it catching the right type of audience? Now, these are comedy-based podcasts, so they will be a little more catchy and a little bit more to the risky side. But as you start looking to add in icons and other images, take a look at, for example, the Outside podcast in the lower right, which we have headphones there in the cover image. And that's perfectly fine and okay to use icons within your image, but just remember that just about every podcast out there could use headphones as part of their image within their cover art. And the question is do you need that icon or logo that you're thinking of putting in within your cover art? Because oftentimes what happens is you could use that space for something else. If you look at the Cooligans, a comedic soccer podcast, also that image or icon there that they have, that's kind of like an emblem, a little bit of crown there. It's a little more complicated to spot. And again, we talked about ease of sight earlier on, and that one makes it a little more difficult. So again, using these images and icons, how easy are they to spot and understand to what the podcast is all about is pretty important. So choose things that are a little bit more simple and to the point where people can really just grasp exactly what it is. Going back to our point number one, keeping things simple. Let's take a look at the next point, which is consistency. If you're building out multiple podcasts, it's good to be consistent in the design or layout of those podcasts. Dave Ramsey does this very well. The way that they use, as you can see, many of the fonts are very similar, blocky, they're thick. A few are a little bit different, maybe Business Boutique has a little more feminine touch, it has a little more cursive, but overall it has a picture of a person. They have kind of this geometric shape where it's a little more rectangular, diagonal going through. And then as you look at the website, again, many of them are bluish tones with the exception of maybe the Leadership or the Chris Hogan podcast. They have a little bit of an orange color, but overall you're seeing that they stick to the yellow tone. Entre Leadership is yellow, Dave Ramsey is yellow, and you have that upper left R logo that's also yellow mixed in with the blue tones pretty much everywhere. So keeping together that consistency is important, especially as you start growing things out in the future from your website to your podcast cover, because people can quickly recognize you through that simplicity. Let's take a look at the future, which is our last point in our show here. And you want to always think about the future of the podcast. What is it that you're looking to develop and create within the show? You probably won't see many podcasts that discuss or talk about just Facebook. Instead, you might see a podcast that's about social media, at which point it covers maybe YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. But if you create a podcast that's all about, let's just say, Facebook, well, that may not be around within 5 or 10 years. And you may beg to argue, but take a look at MySpace, which there were many, many users. And now it's basically non-existent. I mean, it's still around, but the popularity of it has died down. And basically MySpace evolved into Facebook, and that will evolve and continue. It's kind of like looking things back in the day where initially IBM was developing huge computers, and then as they were developing these huge computers, well, they thought that they would also be the leader in personal computing. But what happened there? Well, Microsoft, Windows became kind of the leader. And then as technology evolved, the .com started to boom. Well, who would lead the search engine world? Well, they would assume Microsoft would. It was big in the computer space, but it ended up being Google, right? And again, social media came around. They would assume that Google would be the leader in social media, but it ended up being now more Facebook, Twitter, and these kinds of things. So we're kind of in this era, and now what's going to be the next stage here coming up? Well, no one knows. So it's important that as you look at your podcast along with your artwork, that you don't create it to the point where it limits you on future development and growth. So creating and using icons and images that may be limited on their time, using, like, let's say a Facebook logo, which you shouldn't because of copyright restrictions anyway, but mentioning things in the name like that could limit your podcast for future growth and development. So think about that as you look to evolve and expand to the future. Of course, you could change your artwork, no problem, because things can change very quickly. But remember, you're keeping a lot of things in check as you go through the consistency of your brand, and as your company evolves from your website to maybe business cards, if you're still creating business cards, and that may affect you if you need to make some changes to your artwork. So think about the long term ahead. Make it maybe a little more generic but specific to what you're doing, so that way you can evolve things in the future. Anyways, I hope you found this video helpful to understanding the 6 main key points to creating great podcast covers. In the next show, we're going to take a look at actually creating a podcast artwork piece within Photoshop. So I hope that you join me on that one. So thanks again for joining me, and I'll see you next time.